Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to talk about environmental movements in India. This is the first module in the series of modules on environmental movements. There will be 3 modules on environmental movements in India. In this module we will describe India's environmental movements. This module introduces students to how environmental concerns entered social movements discourses in India. This paper is divided into 2 major sections. The first section on popular environmental movements before 1990 deals with the characteristic and concerns of these movements and why certain movements are more popular than the others. The second section are case studies of Kashipur anti-bauxite mining struggle as well as Niyamgiri struggle spearheaded by Dongaria community there in Orissa. Concerns about environmental problems present in most developing countries as in India is of relatively recent origin. Even the recent awareness and environmental concern at the policy level is due to the advocacy and lobbying of mass movement as well as research by support organizations. At the grassroots level, it is due to efforts by individuals and to a profound sense of experiencing the effects of environmental problems on ecology and livelihood firsthand. The environmental movements in India therefore are not necessarily green or clean or to save heritage and species in danger of extinction as in the West, but for the very survival of the poor people. In order to understand the nature and trajectory of the environmental movements in India, it is intended herein to reflect on the experiences of some of the environmental movement and some of the important movements during the 1970s as well as during the period in post-1991 times when India liberalized its economy. It should be noted that grassroots movements are not necessarily synonymous with movements and environmental movements across the country. Although the origin of modern day environmentalism and environmental movements in India is often attributed to the Chipko movement in the region of the Central Himalayas in the 1970s, in fact protests against Mulshi Dam were the first to combat large-scale displacement in India in 1927 following the approval of Mulshi Dam hydroelectric project in Bombay Presidency, Western India. The fight was a milestone in the history of opposition to involuntary displacement of people from their land. The project was owned by the industrial conglomerate Tata family and was commissioned in 1920s. A total of 11,000 people were displaced and alienated from their traditional rice fields due to this project. Men, women and children from the Malwa community organized a non-violent protest to stop the work on dam site. Finally, several hundred people were arrested and the struggle lasted for 2.5 years. Autocratic British rule suppressed this movement. The Chipko movement, launched to protect the forests of Himalayan tracts from destruction, had its roots in the days before independence. Many battles were organized to protest against the colonial forest policies in the early decade of 20th century in this very region. The main demand of the people was that the benefits of forests, especially right to fodder, must go to the local population. These struggles continued in the post-independence era as well, as forest policy of independent India was no different from that of the colonial times. However, the origin of Chipko can be traced to early 1973. In early 1973, the forest department refused to assign the ash trees to the Dasholi Gram Swarajya Sangha, a local cooperative organization based in Chamoli district to manufacture agricultural tools. In addition to this, the forest department assigned the ash trees to a private company, Siemens. This incident caused Dasholi Gram Swarajya Sangha to fight this injustice of providing timber to a company rather than to a local cooperative by placing themselves in front of trucks of firewood and wood resins and deposits which are being taken out by Siemens, as has been done during the Quit India movement. When these methods were found unsuccessful, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, one of the leaders, suggested the activists should go and hug trees, and therefore Chipko was born. This form of protest helped in stopping private enterprises felling the ash trees, as the people were literally between the axe and the tree. With its success, the movement spread to neighboring regions and came to be popularly known as the Chipko movement. Chipko movement, with its huge following in the neighboring areas, as well as the successful intervention with regard to forest protection through non-violent methods, although modest in achieving some of its objectives, can be termed as a turning point in environmental movements in India. This development of movements in India, in fact, turned on the environmental aspects of development in the country and led to many conflicts and protests for natural resources and the environment. However, despite many forest movements developing in the past 2 decades in India, none of them attracted public support or influenced state policies as much as Chipko has done. This can be attributed to the 3 main aspects of the Chipko movement. First, the close relationship between the livelihoods of the local population and the nature of the movement. Local people considered Chipko as a struggle for basic subsistence denied to them by the institutions and state policies. In addition, there was also the specificity of the region in which the participation of women in contributing to the livelihoods of household and campaign against alcohol led to overwhelming support of women. Also, as aptly described by Ramchandra Guha, the private phase of the Chipko movement was more peasant oriented, while the public profile was considered an ecological movement. It also had a characteristic of a women's movement. Interestingly, in later stages when Chipko stopped going beyond environmental concerns, that is limited its focus to the protection and preservation of trees, the problems began to emerge. The second aspect is about the nature of the turmoil. Unlike other environmental movements, the Chipko movement strictly followed the Gandhian tradition of the struggle for freedom, that is non-violence. To quote Guha, there is the veneer of Gandhianism with which Chipko is cloaked, a matter of some embarrassment for a state claiming to be the rightful successor of the freedom struggle and upholding Gandhi as the father of nation. In this manner, Chipko had, knowingly or unknowingly, successfully exploited the ambiguities in the dominant ideology of the Indian state. Unquote. Thirdly, the sincerity of the leaders as Sri Sundarlal Bahuguna and access to national leaders like Indira Gandhi and other politicians and officials, due to the prominence he gained over the course of the movement, also contributed to the success of the movement greatly. In fact, at first, the Chipko movement had 6 main objectives, one of which was the total cessation of commercial tree felling. Other demands included: 1. Based on the minimum needs of the population, a reorganization of the traditional rights that should take place. 2nd, the dry forest should be green with the participation of the people and the increase in the cultivation of the trees. 3rd, village committees shall be trained in management of forests. 4th, national forest related industries should be developed and raw materials, money and technology be made available. And 5th, based on local conditions and needs, priority shall be given to the local varieties of afforestation. Other important popular movements in India which have the protection of the environment as one of their objectives relate to large dams. Among them are the Tihri Dam, Silent Valley project and Narmada Valley projects, and the movements that arose to oppose this large dam building projects. The longest anti-dam struggle was the Tihri Dam, the struggle against Tihri Dam, which was under construction on the river Bhagirathi in the Gadwal region. The Tihri Bandh Sangharsh Virodhi Samiti, founded by veteran freedom fighter Virendra Saklani Datta, opposed the construction for more than a decade. The main objections included seismic sensitivity of the area, the flooding of forest areas and the town of Tihri, etc. One of the first successful environmental movements leading to the cancellation of a hydroelectric power project was the movement against the Silent Valley hydroelectric power project in Kerala. This movement was organized by Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishada, KSSP, in collaboration with wildlife conservationists. The movement was led mainly for the environmental reasons and especially intellectually by eminent people writing about the impacts of the project on the ecosystems, talking in public meetings both at national level as well as international level. The main concerns of this movement were the negative environmental impact on Silent Valley, one of the last remaining natural tropical forests of India, and to protect a rare species of monkey, the lion-tailed macaque. With the active support of international organizations such as World Wide Fund for Nature and the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, the movement gained international importance. Although it has grown in popularity and coverage, the ultimate success of the movement has been attributed to the desire of the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to improve her government's image within the international conservation community. The most popular movement in the history of environmental movements in India probably is against the Narmada Valley river development projects. Although the movement began in late 1970s as a result of the authorization of the project, it gained prominence and spread over 3 states in late 1980s. First, this movement focused on the issue of human rights as an outcome of displacement of the people. In fact, some of the main leaders of the movement at the time worked for the rehabilitation programs for displaced. Due to the poor implementation of programs of rehabilitation of the people displaced due to the dam, human rights activists became part of the anti-dam protests. Their demands included complete stoppage of the dam construction and resettlement and rehabilitation benefits to the ousties. These claims were duly supported by environmentalists who opposed the construction of large dams on environmental grounds. The movement, however, gained more public attention due to the mobilization and organization of the ousties, mostly indigenous people, and the union of eminent social workers such as Baba Amte, Mehta Patkar, and Sundarlal Bahuguna. Although its focus is the general public because of its impacts in 3 states, the most notable feature of this movement is the international support it received in late 1980s and early 1990s. In fact, the main reason behind the withdrawal of funding from by World Bank into this project was due to international pressure. To list a few examples, Japanese ecologists persuaded their government to block the money advanced for the project. Similarly, US environmental groups worked hard to stop the financing from the World Bank. Such international support was unprecedented in the history of environmental movements in India. The completion of the Narmada Valley project was not directly related to the World Bank funding and therefore the success of the movement. Also, without international pressure, it would have been difficult for the leaders of Narmada Bachao Andolan to stop World Bank funding on their own. The movement petitioned the Supreme Court of India and the dam construction was stayed by the Supreme Court for 6 years between the year 1994 and the year 2000. On 18th October 2000, Supreme Court gave a judgment giving the go-ahead to the dam construction, albeit conditional to the fulfillment of resettlement and rehabilitation as per the Narmada Water Dispute Tribunal award and its stipulations. Supreme Court, during the course of hearing the case, had instituted new bureaucracy known as Grievance Redressal Authority and wished that complaints about incomplete and inadequate resettlement be resolved by this new authority. In the event of old bureaucracy created by Narmada Water Dispute Tribunal stipulations failed to ensure rehabilitation. For last 15 years, it has been an ongoing struggle wherein ousties have kept arguing that successive governments have been raising height of the dam without ensuring complete resettlement and rehabilitation. Significance and popularity of environmental movements in India. At this point, it is important to understand the characteristics and qualities of certain movements which contributed to them becoming so popular while others are not so popular. According to the standard definition of a social movement, it is deliberate collective endeavor to make changes in all directions and by all means, which should have a certain degree of organization and policy commitment and active participation by its members. Movements with multiple objectives and rapidly changing strategies can sustain for longer periods. The cohesiveness involved in the integration of multiple objectives without losing sight of the protests on the ground are essential for success. When we analyze the movements described above, the movements mentioned have 3 distinct support bases on the ground. Chipko with the base as the forests, Silent Valley, Tihri and Narmada being big dam controversies. The success or popularity of the Chipko movement can be attributed to its long history, many goals which have changed with the passage of time, and committed leaders who are respected both at local levels and national level. As the fight against forest policy of the state had begun during the time of pre-independence that accumulated during the period, a broader base of local support provided a solid foundation for the Chipko movement. Chipko's strength lies in its multiple targets with a wide range, such as protecting the livelihood of farmers, the anti-alcohol campaign, the greening of the hills in a sustainable manner, etc. etc. Over time, the mode of addressing these problems has also changed. For this reason, Chipko is often called a farmer or an environmental or even a women's movement. The lack of popular support in the Tihri Dam case can be attributed to its more or less single target, which focused on the seismic impact and submersion of forest land due to the construction of the dam. In addition, the Tihri struggle followed different strategies to attract support from various national and international fora, which did not get enough attention or support. Although successful, the movement against Silent Valley project with limited popular support is essentially intellectual in character, but the popularity of Narmada has several dimensions. The Narmada movement as Chipko began articulating livelihood issues of local populations, moved to human rights articulation and focused on environmental concerns while suggesting an alternative development paradigm. Interestingly, the strategy was to meet all these dimensions simultaneously and effectively. The mass base of the movement are tribal communities affected by dams, which are homogeneous and removed from modern influences and therefore easier to organize, as Patkar has claimed in one of the writings in 1992. Narmada agitation, besides trying different goals, followed different strategies to influence national and international forums, to explain things from a perspective of human rights activists and another for environmental group, without losing contacts with locals. In addition, activists are involved in the socio-economic development of tribal communities, namely the construction of school, clinics, etc., etc. The Narmada Andolan became prominent in the late 1980s when North-South conflict had sharpened on environmental issues. Environmental protection in the South has become one of the main agenda of international activism in the North. This led to the recognition and active support of the Narmada agitation by governmental and non-governmental organizations abroad. This support in turn contributed to pressure the World Bank to stop funding the project because it was anti-environmental. During the same period, there were also other movements that one can attribute as an environmental movement as well. For instance, the movement against the mining of bauxite in the Gandhamardhan range in Odisha has been one of the most successful anti-mining movements in central India. Gandhamardhan is a 90 km long and 20 km wide hill range spread over Padmapur in Baragarh district and Patnagarh subdivision of Bolangi district. It is a part of the Eastern Ghat mountain range of western Odisha and is popularly known by many other names like Vindhyagiri or Gandhagiri. 800 meters above sea level, it is located between 82.54 east longitude and 20.54 north latitude. Balko had come in search of bauxite deposits in Gandhamardhan after completely destroying the hydrological stability and sanctity of another important mountain, Amarkantak in Madhya Pradesh, the source of the water for Narmada, the Son and the Mahanadi rivers. The destruction of Amarkantak to feed its 1 lakh ton aluminum plant in Korba in Chhattisgarh was a high cost to pay for the reserves. In 1978-79, after Balko abandoned Amarkantak hill range in Madhya Pradesh, the then central cabinet minister for mines, Biju Patnaik, showed the way to the holy hills of Gandhamardhan in Odisha. In the 80s, the Congress party and the then chief minister of Odisha, J.V. Patnaik, were only too eager to act on a deal with Balko. In 1983, the then Union Minister of Mines, N.K.P. Salve, along with Chief Minister J.V. Patnaik, laid the foundation stone for Balko's mining project in Gandhamardhan, that was to mine bauxite worth 1,500 crores of rupees annually. Balko promised to give employment to hardly 2,000 local people with the requisite qualifications and experiences. This was a mockery on the local people who hardly had any education and experience in the process of mining bauxite. Two specific incidents inflamed people to join the movement to save their hill god from the brutalities of mining. Firstly, a test blast in the Gandhamardhan hill shook the ancient Narsingnath temple to such an extent that Garuda Sabha collapsed and tremors were felt both in distant villages, including the two major centers of belief, Harishankar and Nrusingnath. Cracks due to the tremors were so strong in many places that utensils and other household materials fell down, making people feel the effects of blasting firsthand. Secondly, the check dam made by Balko at Manabhanga in the name of supporting irrigation turned out to be a sham, as instead of building anything beneficial for the people, it submerged around 30 acres of fertile lands and the famous orchards of Madhuban, the primary source of livelihood for people of 5 gram panchayats. These two incidents fueled the movement against Balko. The mass dissatisfaction took a fierce shape in the Nrusingnath temple congregation, and the seed of an organized movement to save Gandhamardhan was sown in February 1985. The news of Paikamal agitation did spread like wildfire to the districts Bolanjir, Baragarh, Sambalpur, Kalahandi, Nuapada, and even to the neighboring state Chhattisgarh. In the summer vacation of 1985, a group of NSS volunteers from Sambalpur University had camped in Gandhamardhan Hills. The campers observed the situation and could feel the impending danger to the Gandhamardhan and the complete ecosystem if mining was to continue in the region. Some of the campers formed a group for protection of Gandhamardhan. In an organized manner, they spread awareness amongst the people of that area. On the 14th of August of 1985, 19 young men joined hands to form the Gandhamardhan Suraksha Yuva Parishad and shouted with slogans that echoed in every household. Amar Dabi Man Sarkar, Balko Asura Neither Kar, which means government must concede to our demands, we do not need Balko monster. The reverberation reached the government and Balko was forced to move out and the people's movement won the battle temporarily. After several rounds of discussions with people of that area to motivate them in support of Balko, the then Chief Minister Janki Vallabh Patnaik realized the significance of Gandhamardhan and its links with the life and sentiment of the people. In meetings between the public and representative of Balko and Chief Minister Janki Vallabh Patnaik, the Balko officials were at a loss to answer the public questions raised by the Chief Minister. In an endeavour at justice, J.V. Patnaik withdrew the permission given to Balko on 15 September 1989 to mine Gandhamardhan Hills. Environmental movements in the era of liberalization, post-1990s. The process of globalization have greatly increased the environmental conflicts. Earlier, the penetration rate was limited by the availability of resources and state-based development model. With the liberalization of the Indian economy, there is now an increase in foreign direct investment in India, particularly in industrial and mining sectors. In Jharkhand, Orissa, Chhattisgarh and Andhra Pradesh, which is the center of the central tribal belt, state governments have signed several memorandum of understanding with private companies for development projects. It should be noted that 1/5 of the total population of the overall tribal population has already been displaced since independence. The displacement of the population during the era of liberalization moved beyond the earlier phases. The tribal people of Jharkhand fell from 60% in 1911 to 26.63% in 1991. Since the beginning of the current era of economic liberalization, tribal communities across the country and central India have been involved in protests and movements against these development projects. It is argued by a section of academics who have been writing about the importance of a liberal market economy that multinational investments in industries based on minerals in the tribal region which are rich in natural resources increase export earnings and accelerated economic growth, which in turn amounts to socio-economic transformation of the tribal population. An important aspect of this development is that the tribes who resist all efforts of the state to deprive them of their lands are now faced with large national and international capitalist companies. The combined power of state capital and business is too daunting an opposition for the tribes to take for themselves. These so-called development projects interfere with every aspects of life and tribal control over the means of production that they need to survive. The tribal belt of the district of Koraput, Bolangir and Kalahandi in Orissa has experienced unrest and tribal mass demonstrations since 1990s. The majestic plateau of the northwest part of Rayagada district in Orissa contain almost 1/3 of bauxite deposits in India. These plateaus are home to almost 1,000 permanent rivers and huge dense forests. The region is mainly inhabited by Indian tribes, which are highly dependent on forest-covered mountains in the area for their livelihood. Permanent streams are needed for local agriculture during the rare period of drought or rain and were the lifeline of tribal people. The land inhabited by them is increasingly invaded by several multinationals seeking to exploit the large deposits of bauxite in the region. Among the multinationals, there are two large corporations, Utkal Alumina International Limited and Vedanta Alumina Limited, that have signed memorandum of understanding with the government of Odisha to mine bauxite. In 1993, Orissa began its project to create aluminum plants in Kashipur region rich in minerals. The Utkal Alumina International Limited has signed a memorandum of understanding with the government for the bauxite mine in Orissa's Baflimali Hill and a process of bauxite refinery in Ramibeda. The project UAIL displaced more than 5,000 families from about 100 villages. However, it is supposed to create jobs for about 1,000 people only, but no employment opportunities for 5,000 tribal families which would be affected by the project. Mining activities have been destroying habitats and forest ecosystems with perennial water streams that provide natural resources for survival and livelihood of the tribal families in more than 14 villages. In the period between 1998 and 2000, the tribal in this region have resisted UAIL project, and the movement was particularly strong in Kashipur block. The movement was not only against UAIL but was also against the proposed bauxite mining by Bharat Aluminium Company Limited. Local movements were supported by several organizations, international and local NGOs. Some of the organizations were Prakritik Suraksha Parishad of Kashipur, Vasundhara Suraksha Samiti, Vanasampada Suraksha Samiti in the villages of Kashipur block, and Bafli Mali Suraksha Samiti in Kashipur, and Chasi Mulia Sangha Raigada or Koraput. Local NGOs like the Lakshman Nayak Agragami Ankuran Company and the weaker section Integrated Development Agency and international NGOs such as Action Aid, Care India, HEWOS and Norwatch supported the movement. Despite huge protests and support in all areas, the government of Orissa has not responded to the movement favorably. Activists involved in the movement have been recognized and booked under the provisions of National Security Act, which allows no bailable warrant, and are arrested and subjected to intimidation. The company was authorized to start work on this project, and the work continued to grow while the movement has been reduced in its capacity to draw support. The London-based company proposed to operate the mine in Niyamgiri Hills called Vedanta Aluminium Limited in conjunction with Orissa Mining Corporation. Under the agreement, the company has launched an aluminium refinery plant in Lanchigad. The total investment was approximately 4,000 crores for this purpose, and 723.43 hectares of land was acquired by VAL. This involved 232.75 hectares of private land, most of which belong to Dongaria Kon tribes and is considered forest land. 12 villages in the Gram Panchayat and the Batalima Lanchigad will be affected by the proposed aluminium refinery in Lanchigad. In these villages, 60 families were supposed to be moved and 302 families acquired land for the project. However, in reality, 102 families and 1,220 families lost their land. Consequently, a resistance movement was formed by the tribes who were forcibly evicted from their land. Dongaria Kon tribes mainly depend on forests for their livelihoods in Niyamgiri Hills, and therefore proposed bauxite mining is a major threat to their livelihoods. The movement was not only against displacement of tribal peoples, but also about the violation of environmental laws and forest conservation. Extensive farming in the mountains of Niyamgiri threatens the entire ecosystem, and destruction of rivers that flow into the mountain. In addition, it is also a violation of the 1996 law, Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act. The Ministry of Environment and Forest consented to the mining of the jungle after a request was made on March 28, 2005, although the MOEF refused logging on September 22, 2004. The change in the stand of the MOEF is attributed to access VAL had to key ministries, both the state and central government and administration. The gravity of events and the movement against the project forced the National Environmental Appellate Authority to suspend authorization granted to VAL on September 17, 2010 by an order. Therefore, the government of Odisha has now made a desperate appeal to the Supreme Court in April 2011 against the withdrawal of the environmental clearance to VAL. On April 18, 2013, the Supreme Court then ordered Gram Sabhas to be held in 12 villages in the area to determine the views of forest dwellers on the proposed mining in their area. It was the first referendum on environmental issues in the history of India, and Gram Sabhas gave their verdict against proposed mining by Vedanta Alumina Limited, Lanchigad. As for the dynamics of events and movements in Kashipur and Lanchigad, the results are mixed. Although the causes of events and movements were the same, and the movements were supported by several national and international NGOs, organizations and human rights activists, the movement in Kashipur has failed, while the movement in Lanjigad to protect Niyamgiri mountain range has been successful. The contrasting findings raise questions about the factors that determine the success and failures of such struggles. Looking at the dynamics of events and movements in Kashipur and Lanjigad, the results are mixed. The contrasting findings raise questions. In Kashipur, the major political parties like Congress Party, Biju Janata Dal and Bharatiya Janata Party have formed an all-party committee to support the project and act in the project, which involved a private army which threatened indigenous people from the lands so that UAIL could continue with the construction contracts. The two ruling parties and the opposition supported the project, and the environmental movement and its supporters were thus easily removed. The link between the state and Utkal Alumina International Limited and strategy against the movement led to the suppression of popular movements. As with the movement of Kashipur, in Lanjigad, the movement received broad support from various national and international environmental NGOs, human rights organizations and activists. However, the most important aspect in the success was that they received the full support of the opposition parties in the state, the Congress Party and Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. The leaders of these opposition parties in the state were very active in the resistance movement in Lanjigad. This project caused a serious political conflict between the party in political power, the BJD, and the opposition Congress Party. The BJD supported the project and called for the development of the field and increasing use of production through mega projects like Vedanta Alumina Limited. The opposition party, however, have highlighted the serious impact on the ecosystem and biodiversity of Niyamgiri mountain range, despite support for industrial policy of the state in legislature. The member of Legislative Assembly was a minister in charge of the Orissa tribal development, and he helped to organize some tribes to mount a protest outside Supreme Court in favor of the company project. However, interestingly, the member of parliament seat at the national general election in 2009 was won by the opposition. The new MP, Bhaktacharan Das from Kalahandi, mobilized support among pro-Congress and Congress intellectual of the party leadership in the capital New Delhi against the mining project. Thus, the Congress party, which was in charge of the central government at the time, decided to paralyze the Vedanta Alumina Limited project. As the movement in Kashipur and Lanjigad was a link between the government leaders in charge of the government of Orissa and the Vedanta Alumina Limited company, and together they mobilized a strategy against the suppression of the opposition movement. But the opposition parties, particularly the Congress party, were able to put a lot of pressure on the government in power in Odisha to stop the project. In conclusion, as for the movements in India during immediate post-independence period, most of the environmental movements had been crushed under the weight of dreams of a young post-colonial nation state, which was on a nation-building mission. However, since mid-1970s, several movements began to succeed, such as Chipko movement, Narda Bachao Andolan, and Silent Valley. When they were supported by several organizations of human rights, national and international environmental groups, NGOs, and activists, arriving in the current era of liberalization since 1990s, a large number of demonstrations and environmental movements have taken place all over India. Most movements are focusing on industrial and mining sectors, which have received much foreign investments and have placed a huge impact on the natural environment, where the livelihoods of tribal people are at stake. Although almost all environmental groups have received substantial support from national and international human rights and environmental NGOs and activists, only some of these movements have had no success. An analysis of movements in Kashipur and Lanjigad shows that those who succeed tend to have strong support from the political parties of the opposition. On the other hand, where there is no support from opposition political parties and there are closer links between the state and transnational corporation, it is easier for the state to repress environmental movement.